In Hong Kong with fascination. I've been trying to figure out what they mean for Hong Kong, but also for China. The situation brought to mind for me a book published a few years back by a Chinese-American academic, Min-Shin Pei. It's called China's Trap Transition. In it, Pei invoked the most established law in political science, that over time, countries that grow economically tend to become more democratic. Oil-rich states that are usually run by dictators are the exception. China had achieved decades of growth, Pei pointed out, and yet had seen almost no moves toward political openness, the world's great exception. Around the time of the book's publication, in 2006, Pei predicted that because of this mismatch between economic growth and political stagnation, problems would emerge 6 to 7 years later. In other words, right about now. And indeed, the scholar says, Hong Kong's turmoil today has huge implications for China. Pei argues that perhaps what explains the Chinese anomaly is that in China, the ruling elites have been united, confident, and ferocious in their determination to maintain a one-party system. In Taiwan, after Chiang Ching-kuo's death, the elites split, as they did in South Korea, in Indonesia, and of course, in the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev. That kind of split between a reformist wing and a hardline wing has not happened in China. There's another analogy to the Soviet case. The pressure for reform in Russia in the 1980s was real but limited. It was pervasive in Poland and Czechoslovakia, which were the most economically developed countries under Soviet influence. And that put pressure on the whole Soviet system and on Moscow itself. Hong Kong is like Eastern Europe, a rich but unfree outpost of the empire. Pei cautions that the events in Hong Kong are unlikely to spill over into the mainland. He says, quote, "The system of control, patronage, and surveillance on the mainland is too strong," unquote. I would add that there is also considerable support in China for the status quo. It has quadrupled the average person's income over the past 2 decades. But Pei argues the Hong Kong protests could produce rifts within the Communist Party, as it has to deal with issues of dissent and repression now and in the future. The solution for China is obvious: political reform. This has been seen and advocated by many senior leaders within the party, including Wen Jiabao. In 2 interviews with me, Wen, premier of China from 2002 to 2012, insisted that political reform had to follow economic reform. But it never happened because reform threatens the party's monopoly of power. China will not become a Western-style liberal democracy, but it should consider the example of Singapore, a city-state with a strong one-party system, but one that also has legal opposition parties, reasonably free elections, and real independent courts. Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping famously visited Singapore in November 1978 and learned about Singapore's free market economic system before beginning reforms at home. President Xi Jinping would do very well to take a similar trip to that city-state pretty soon. For more, go to cnn.com/Fareed and read my Washington Post column this week.